from SAP. Darrel is the industry head financial services at SAP Africa. Welcome, Darrel.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. That was a great presentation. Thank you for staying. I want to try to describe, my history is in banking, as you probably heard. I also wear an SAP hat, which means that we have a vested interest in a particular view of how blockchain plays out. I'll try and talk to you a little about that. And then also talk to you about some of the challenges we see in moving forward for blockchain to become a much more dominant technology and to try to understand what we think that means for the way we do our business and for the way our customers do their business. You know, we're probably one of the world's biggest systems of record. Even when you're using Ethereum or something else, you're probably touching an SAP system somewhere in the world because there's a general ledger transaction and a chart of accounts, and somewhere through that whole process, a regulator is looking over your shoulder, and the person who's accountable in the bank is looking over your shoulder. And I want to talk a little bit about the inherent conflict between what this presents, blockchain as a technology, and some of these kind of dominant themes that society's evolved, and how I think we should think about tackling some of them, because it won't happen, you know, on its own, as you've just heard and has been well described. So, okay. So, my first point is just that the world is littered with great technologies that didn't work. They didn't succeed. They were much better technologies than the existing world status quo. They functioned better. They were more efficient. They had huge benefits that the existing status quo didn't have, but they didn't succeed. And so it's interesting to think about why that might be. And I want to talk about that a little. Also, I want to just talk about what happens to the stakeholder game. Fundamentally, blockchain changes the nature of the role players. And if it changes the nature of the role players, then it does something to rights and accountability. And in a society where these things have been clearly defined in an existing status quo, which is changing slowly, sometimes quickly, but is established, part of Andreas's point was, how do we deal with the way that this changes? And in a lot of ways, blockchain is contradictory to the status quo, as you've kind of understood. And that means that tackling it to succeed means you can't follow the conventional norms, I don't think. And what I want to do is try to challenge some of our thinking on where we should look for doing that. We've talked about who makes the rules, and then I want to talk in particular about individual rights, the rights that you and I as individuals have, and what blockchain potentially does for those, and not only the people who are using Bitcoin, because that's just the currency part of it, but those who might be players in the blockchain world and are in the excluded 4 billion that Andreas was talking about. How do we make it possible for all of those people to be included in a way that actually gives them value and drives a fundamental shift in the way that society deals with things? So we talk about blockchain in SAP as a distributed ledger, and the appealing thing for us, of course, is that you have this ability to create a record which has multiple participants, it's visible, it's trusted, it's open, and it becomes an indisputable view of the truth. And, of course, most people in the world at the moment claim to do that anyway. If you went to your bank, they would tell you that this version of their record that they have in their system is the undisputed version of the truth. And many times, as you know, that nothing could be further from the truth. And the reason for that is really simple. The reason for that is that the people who are creating all the rules about what creates that record are controlled by the people who create the record. So it's their rules. You play, I play, we all play by their rules. And while we're playing by their rules, they will use whichever credible records they create to drive their own processes. The fact that multiple steps in that chain may have come about as an invalid or incorrect or erroneous or fraudulent set of steps, it doesn't matter when you're having to deal with that, because you're playing with a set of rules that were created by your bank in this case. And if you look at how technologies have succeeded, it seems obvious that there's a convergence needed for things to come together in order for them to become mainstream. And some of these are driven by the social structure of the society, our governance, our democratic institutions, their success or failure, their strength or weakness, our view as democratic citizens in these societies. I have the rights and powers to do certain things, significantly strengthened in the last while by our democratic dispensation in South Africa. I mean, I was talking to some foreigners the other day, and they were saying, why is it in South Africa everyone wants to sue? And the reason for that is that all of a sudden we've got a society that's much more equal, and we've got people who didn't have rights before who are saying, no, actually, you can't do that. You don't have the right. Whereas in the past, this was an unbridled right. And many of the things that were done in the name of society and these structures and in good governance actually didn't have rights at all. And the blockchain fundamentally challenges those. And I just want to talk about that for a moment. So the success of technologies comes about because you have this convergence of social acceptance, which in turn is a subset of individuals' rights, the different stakeholders and rules and governance. And then you have a similar process in the technologies which brings them all together, and suddenly you have the ability to be able to do things. And for the blockchain to succeed, it has to advance equally over many of these fronts in order to gain acceptance. Because it's possible that any single one could completely derail it. And it doesn't mean that blockchain is not better or more efficient, or it just means that there are some obstacles that couldn't be counted. And as I said, history is littered with examples of technologies that didn't succeed, even though they were much better than the prevailing ones. So the first point is this thing about the social structures and the societies in which we live. Now, the biggest challenge I see is that when an individual becomes a full participant in the blockchain world, what it does, it immediately assumes rights that didn't exist before for an individual. You and I don't exist as individuals other than physically in our bodies. We don't own the rights to our information. Our names are owned by the bank in our FICA record. Our bank balances are owned by our bank. Our record of our property transaction is owned by the deeds office. There's a whole string of things that define our identity that are needed for us to be able to function in everyday life that we don't own or manage. And because we don't own or manage them, we don't have control over how they're used. And the way they're used can be abused and is abused. And it's used for gain. It's used by people in big data environments. It's used by Facebook. It's used by Google. And all of these people are largely doing this without our consent. The interesting thing about blockchain is what it does is it elevates the rights of the individual to an equal participant. It says, actually, if you want to use information about me and I'm party to this thing, this transaction, whatever it is, then I have rights over how this stuff gets used. I can control the access and the distribution of what the data is going to do. And I'm party to the transaction, whatever it might be, a contract, a financial transaction, anything else. And this is completely in conflict with the societal norms of how we do a lot of the governance that occurs in societies. You can see that, it's obvious. Because what banks don't want is somebody who's negotiating with them as an equal. Nor do any other stakeholders in the chain. Governments don't want that. What they want is a rule that says you will prescribe to this set of rules in order to play, and if you play by these rules, then we will grant you the ability to do A, B, and C. So the biggest challenge we have to deal with is that intrinsically it changes the nature of the individual rights. And when the individual rights get elevated, suddenly new world opportunities get open to people. And people can start to do things individually and collectively when they recognize that we have power over our own identity. I mean, I know for a fact, I've recently relocated to Cape Town. I know that half the records about me are wrong. At least half. The half that I know are not right, I don't even know where they are. I don't know who holds them. Because every single person who's had to identify me as a party in any kind of contractual relationship has established a definition based on their own internal processes. And these processes are defined by those stakeholders. And what the blockchain does is it fundamentally alters those, and it makes all of the participants equal in this process. And that is going to have huge ramifications in the way that we go forward. So individuals, the unbanked, people who are outside of this group and other groups like this, for them to be brought in, we have to persuade them that there's opportunity for them to increase their ability to be able to generate gain. And whether it's time gain, money gain, recognition gain, participation gain, democratic voting gain, they won't move until there's more trust in something else than there is in what they currently have to do with, even if it's flawed. And that's very, very important. The second point is that the governance and accountability, notwithstanding that it's not bulletproof, in many cases is used by societies to regulate the way that things happen. So a central bank determines the amount of money that should be issued into an economy through the money supply, through M1 and M2. It does this by calculating how much money is being spent and how much is being saved. And then it takes appropriate action to issue bonds and increase the fluidity of the currency in the economy. The moment you take a set of financial transactions and transfer of assets out of this system and you deal with them somewhere else, nobody has view of what's going on. So effectively, if you had substantial values of transactions in the Bitcoin world taking place outside of the formal currency system, the regulator couldn't regulate because he wouldn't know what the money supply situation in South Africa looks like, which means he couldn't do anything about the exchange rate, which means he couldn't know when to issue bonds or not to issue bonds. And so fundamentally, this is in contrast to what the existing evolved economic models have led to believe, because these have been developed over 100 years, 150 years of economic theory by Keynes and others to say this is how the world should work in order to mitigate risk and so on. And of course, Mr. Trump and others before him, Bush and the Patriot Act, have also said, and by the way, we will also use these structures to manage you as an individual. We want to know where you are, what you're doing, and we want to make sure that none of your money is landing up with ISIS. And while you have a system that's capable of not honoring those societal norms, structural norms, which have evolved with economics, you have a real challenge in getting widespread appeal. Because until you can get to a point where the people who are in control of some of those levers economically, they're going to be in the way because they're not going to play ball. Even agreeing to a closed-loop system with a cryptocurrency to do a particular thing doesn't get you there because it's still inside the ambit. If it's just a straight transfer of rands to bitcoins for particular transactions, then back into rands for settlement, that doesn't get you there because it doesn't satisfy a lot of what the Bitcoin is about. And so it's really, really important that we think hard about how we mobilize to deal with the form of governance and management that's associated with these structures which occur in the economy. And then thirdly, we have entrenched systems of risk and benefit. I ran pricing for a really long time at one of the big banks in South Africa. Banks are not going to be the first volunteers, as Andreas described, to volunteer for a system that doesn't charge any fees. It's just not going to happen. What they're going to try to do is find a way to use this thing to get more fees. So the whole vehicle that Bitcoin would represent and blockchain would represent to a financial institution which has a structured way, and the rest of the economy, by the way, as well, that would include in a mortgage transaction the estate agent, it would include the attorney, it would include the person who's putting up, doing the marketing, to include every single person in the value chain. None of those people have a vested interest in establishing a very efficient market which effectively does away with all of the overheads and reduces the ability for entrenched stakeholders to generate the kinds of returns that they need to. So all of their energy will be directed at increasing control, not decreasing it. Because it's obvious that if you're an estate agent and there's a way of finding, settling a transaction which has none of the overheads associated with paying an estate agent, I hope none of you are married to any, but they're an absolute rip-off. It's one of my target industries, them and credit in a bank. But if you look at what happens in some of those industries, it's absolutely exorbitant. And it's very hard to explain the economic commercial value associated with those transactions. And a process which did away with this completely or charged very, very, very thin margins would fundamentally undermine some of that. So economically, societally, we're going to have to deal with how we get to convince people that there's another way of doing this which does away with all of this, which doesn't, prevents everybody mobilizing as if there's Armageddon is around the corner. The other point is that in a standard blockchain transaction, as you get these individual stakeholders to participate, and you start to broaden the reach of it, so it's not just a financial transaction, for example, which goes from point A to point B with all the settlement in the middle. It actually does other things contracts, for example, multiple participants to contracts, multiple parties, individuals party to a contract, then all of a sudden you create the opportunity for people to leverage their power, as I was saying just now, in a completely different way, because they suddenly have elevated status in their rights, in their participation in the process, and when that happens, per definition, you change the status quo, and when you change the status quo, then the delta, the movement in the structure, means that people have different opportunities. So that's going to be really, really important going forward, is to find use cases that demonstrate opportunities for people that don't currently exist. And I'll talk about what we think some of those are just now. And then there's the technology. So we've got these processes coming together, societal changes, challenges, obstructions, and on the technology side, we've got, there it is. We've got the challenge with standards. The first defense against the blockchain from any established participant is there are no standards. And that's not rooted in the fears of corruption or hacking or anything. It's that society, industry can't play by rules that aren't defined. Payment system is a good example. If you want to participate in the South African payment system, you've got 3 test dates a year. You're ready or you're not. You move to the next one. And it doesn't matter if your business model was ready or not ready, or your investors, unless you play by the rules of that payment system, you don't participate. So the classical defense of the incumbents is to build more. And so it's really, really important that we start to talk to regulators and we start to talk to market participants about benefits that can be achieved that are not in the domain of threatening anything that they do at the moment. Because the easiest way to antagonize people is to indicate to them what this new thing is going to do that's really good, that's going to make them lose tons of cash. And the market participants have the dominant power in the economy. The unbanked, the faceless, voiceless people do not have. Notwithstanding that they may process hundreds of millions of transactions a day, a week, a year, and which are fundamental to the success of including wider society in our governance and in the success of our society, they are not participants, they can't be. And so it's very, very important that we start to work with these regulators and other people and bring them into the fold rather than trying to demonstrate that it's possible to do these things in ways in which they have less control, less efficiency, less management, and in particular for the existing incumbents, less profit. And that may be undoable. Andreas was using a couple of examples where, in the end, if there is an end, some of this may be in complete conflict with the existing business models. And so people who are the billionaires now and the shareholders, clearly won't be in 5 or 10 years if this succeeds. But some of these hurdles have to be got over in order for that to happen. And then, of course, there's the problem with accountability. So if people can steal and easily with no accountability, I'm not suggesting that doesn't happen in the formal system anyway. You just have to open our newspapers every day. So let's say, if people can steal and nobody can understand how or why, that's probably more definitive, and nobody's accountable, then that's a problem. And so all of the people involved in this world of blockchain have to be actively working to erode the possibilities of people being able to do that. And I'm not just talking about the tech, the code. I'm talking about the way it's deployed, the way it's managed, the way it's governed. Because if it's about mutual trust, it must be about mutual trust that people can put their own trust in. Because if they can't put their own trust in it, why would they trust that more than something which they trust a little bit more at the moment, but at least is known? And it's very, very important that from a technology point of view, we increase the levels of accountability and trust, and people must go to jail. There are lots of other places people must go to jail. Sorry. In South Africa, there are lots. But in this situation, where people are guilty of abusing the trust that's so fundamental to building its success, people must go to prison. If we're not active about that, then all we do is we impede the ability of this to succeed over time. Because it can't. Because it militates against the strength and courage of individuals to take it on and to do the things and to move to new business models. And then, of course, on the benefits and risk, I think the business case for a much more efficient, better way of managing the technology is quite clear. Okay. So, you all know this guy. You all know this guy? Sorry? Charlie Shrem. Yes, Charlie Shrem, he's out of jail, is he?
Yeah. He was released.
Sorry?
He was released.
He was released. Did he serve his full time? He did. So he went to jail for 2 years. The reason he went to jail was he was running a Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency where it was found that people were using the cryptocurrency to buy drugs illegally. The point is not that you can buy drugs illegally with cash down the road. That's not the point. The point is that he was using a registered, authentic business to legitimize it. He wasn't active in doing it, but it was possible for participants in his model to do that. And to the extent that that's possible, people won't put their money there. If blockchain is about trust, banks are about trust. Moving your money is about trust. It's going to be very difficult to do that. And so it's really, really important, I think, that we think very hard about how we build the levels of accountability to make sure that these kinds of things don't happen. Because I suspect that those regular incidences of those kind of events are going to, make it quite difficult for people to move more quickly. So I've talked about standards. Okay, so SAP. I said, we're the biggest system of record. One of the biggest. Probably us and Larry Ellison. What matters to SAP is, our vision is to make the world run better. What do we know? We know that in order for processes to succeed, for people to live better, you have to be able to deliver in a mobile world every single thing that's required by a customer on demand with the deepest level of insight and security. You have to know that. Much of our R&D, which is significant, I mean, in world terms, it's enormous, is invested in making it possible for those things to happen much more efficiently. We are vested in our customers' interest to the extent that they pay us to do that, because not everybody has an R&D shop where they can work out how to synchronize the delivery of complex value chains across the planet, which involve stock being delivered, and all sorts of things. And we've built capability to know how to do that. We also have the interesting benefit that we do this cross-industry. So although I'm in banking and insurance, I spend as much time talking at the moment to retailers about banking as I do to banks. I spend as much time talking to insurance companies about banking as I do to banks. And we have a whole range of fintechs and startups that are interested in doing banking-related things. So the notion of delivering financial transactions across a value chain in a complex world, in a real-time world, is becoming more and more ubiquitous. And it actually doesn't matter what sort of business you're in, because people are completely relaxed about the fact I was in retail doesn't mean I can't do insurance, I can't do banking, I can't deliver other things. They don't care. And they happen to recognize that the competence that they have in customer data and the ability to use that to the benefit of individuals can deliver benefits across the entire value chain. So our thinking is that it's critical for us to understand the role that blockchain could play in making markets and processes more efficient and delivering with more confidence on any part of it. It doesn't matter what industry we're in. We do this in oil and gas. We do this all over. And so our thinking is that as we take the lessons from all the different industries that we've got to understand about how processes work and how goods are delivered and how they're manufactured and how they're costed and how they're priced and how the payment moves, it's critical that we're able to synchronize these and integrate them in a way that allows businesses to run effectively. And behind all of this, you still have an auditor who has to sign off financial accounts. You still have a regulator who has to get his reports. You still have people who have to get paid. You still have people who have to have their deductions taken off, medical aids that have to run, all of those things that make the society as we know it work. And our thinking is that we look at this cross-country and we actually have loads and loads of opportunities of leveraging opportunities in the Bitcoin. My personal view is that the breakthrough is not going to come in the conventional sector. It's not going to come because we can move a debit from Somalia to Uruguay at the drop of a coin. It's not going to happen. because there are too many obstacles that have to be broken in order for that to occur. Not technically. SAP has done some work where we moved in 22 seconds from somewhere in Canada to somewhere in Eastern Europe in the accounts on both sides using Ripple. Done. So technically, there's no problem. The difficulty is we had to navigate multiple regulators in the process. And to get authentication and rights to be able to do that would take us years of negotiation as an R&D house on the outside of the system. So my thinking is that the opportunity is going to come from something completely in a white space, which is suddenly going to produce evidence that it can align individuals, that the elevation of individual rights makes this an interesting and beneficial market for everyone to play, and it doesn't fundamentally challenge the existing rules and standards and governance that occur in society. So if, for example, in South Africa, you wanted to create property rights for rural people who are living on tribal land, there was some way of saying the person who had owned a piece of land and has for generations is somewhere in northern KwaZulu-Natal, should own this piece of property and have rights to it. And you could create a blockchain process which allowed them to record that with other participants as the sole and undisputed record of their access or rights over a piece of property by rental or otherwise. You wouldn't be in anybody's space, really, because the deeds office can't do it. The people who need to go and research the land and put pegs in the ground can't do it. Banks won't touch it. Local authorities don't have the manpower and probably couldn't do it anyway. But you would suddenly create a market of people who are outside of the financial services system or out of the formal system where they had access to assets which they could trade. And all of a sudden, they would be able to say, well, I have access to a piece of land, I have it by lease or otherwise, I want to actually leverage this to be able to do some things. And I want to do it in an efficient market. It mustn't cost me money. You can't charge me like money, like Western Union, 6% of the transaction or 12% of the transaction to move from A to B. I should be able to do this without any overhead. And suddenly you would have something coming from outside the system which then could apply standards. We could generate a set of governance around it. And all of a sudden you'd have banks saying, okay, but we'd like to lend to that market because it's formal. We can give money, we recognize the individual, they're formal, we know who they are, we know where they live, we know where they come from. And suddenly you'd have a market. And that, in my view, would be far, far less threatening to the existing system to make it possible for it to advance. It's a gamble. I don't know whether it would happen that way. It just seems to me that it's much more likely that in our thinking, the R&D and the effort we're putting in should be thinking about white spaces, those things Andreas was talking about that don't exist as business models today, where we could suddenly, by just having a couple of things line up correctly, advance the cause dramatically in a very short period of time, and make markets which suddenly would impose on the formal system, because then they would have to deal with it. The government would have to deal with it. The central bank would have to deal with it. The regulator would have to deal with it. And suddenly we'd be in a completely different place. So we spend a lot of time. We have some very, very good people, some of who are here today, thinking about innovation and how we can leverage some of this. How do we take social media, integrate this properly? How do we take learning about customers' behavior? How do we use that to facilitate transactions which are bankable, not in the banking sense, but in a lifestyle sense? And my belief is that some of this will succeed. There's so much money going into this in so many places that I think it's just a matter of time until we do see some breakthroughs. So
great. Thank you very much, Darrel. Do we have any questions?
Hi. Thanks, and thanks for a really great presentation. My question is that, the reason that we don't have a gold standard or that the European exchange mechanism, while the UK abandoned that in the early 1990s, is particularly because government used the price of money to stimulate growth, address issues around employment, and there's a reason why Reserve Bank governors is often regarded as the most powerful person in any country. Correct, because of that. Yeah. And the ability to manage the economy. You can argue whether it's right or wrong. But a blockchain or the cryptocurrencies would significantly limit the extent, and limit is I'm understating.
Yeah.
the ability for the Reserve Bank to manage the economy. We've seen world over when economies don't have the ability to manage the price of debt and M1, M2, and M3, it severely impacts the ability for the economy to manage itself because of irrational behavior. So, in your view, how would this impact that, and how would that limit countries to embrace Bitcoin or blockchain? That's the first. And the second very, very quick question is, gold has no intrinsic value. For the last 2,000 years, it's still a store of value when there's ever volatility in the world, and for no real good reason, because we like holding things, feeling things, and seeing things. So within that context, and that you have this 4.5 billion unbanked people in the world that still want to hold and see things, how do you see the world taking and adopting blockchain as a primary means of transfer?
So I think it's, on the first point, the central banks, I mean, only in fool would argue that bank regulators and central bank governors, have done a fine job. Andreas talked about 2008. I mean, at best they've got a tenuous grip. But the problem with that is that they're incumbent. So they're there, and they make the rules. And so the difficulty is that whatever seeks to encroach on that space or seeks to supplement it or replace it has to demonstrate improved capability to do some of the things that are still key to society. Because even though they don't do a great job and they've really messed up the economy, along with the Wall Street bankers, the truth is there's nothing else there. So if not that, what? And so the difficulty is that in the blockchain world, we have to advance thinking that deals with some of those intrinsic problems that they are trying to deal with. And I don't know what the answers to those are. I mean, there are a lot of really smart people around the world and research places thinking about this. And we have to find a way to do that. I think that in terms of the unbanked, I suspect that it may be possible that, I've worked all over Africa in emerging markets, and I've done consulting in banks and worked with central bankers. And the interesting thing is that where there's a white space in the economy, they're much more open to solutions, even if they're regulated. So, in Kenya, before M-Pesa, no one was banked. 30% of the population, 25% was banked. But when M-Pesa came along, it went to 70 in 5 years. Because there was a huge vacuum of people needing to transact every day. The average transaction on Safaricom for airtime is 12 shillings or something. It's a tiny amount. So there was all this stuff going on in the economy that people needed an efficient market for that didn't exist. And so right now, if you went and tried to go to Kenya and you tried to do something that was in the same space, it would be hard. Because there's an incumbent. And there's a value proposition that's understood and known. And so I think that the issue on the gold and the sense of values, we have to find use cases that give people something that they can hold on to. That was my point about the customers. We have to persuade customers that, particularly those who don't have something now, it's going to be easier if they don't have something, that this particular way of doing things has far more value, reliability, trust, evidence than the one that existed before, which in many cases is nothing. It goes right to SAP. We do work with farmers, emerging farmers in Uganda, where we built markets on the mobile in USSD, where they collect their stock. And it gets gathered in stores, and then it gets rolled up, and then it gets collected by the producer. And then, because there was nothing. And then the regulator was really open about how this could work. So I think the use cases are going to be critical. And I think it's too easy to think that there's arbitrage in the securities market, so it's really easy to facilitate payments from A to B, and we can do this much better, much more efficiently. The problem is the incumbent strength of the players is going to make it very, very difficult to succeed, notwithstanding that the technology is efficient. So, I don't have an answer on that, but I think it's going to be a real challenge. We have to think very hard about use cases, empowering use cases, ones that will leverage, will empower the individual, the lowest parts of society, en masse, to be able to do things, whether it's in contract, property, financial transactions, whatever.
Great. Any more questions? Darrel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lovely to have an enterprise view. Much appreciated. Good. Thank you.